This video completes the story of Marquette and Jolliet, beginning with what happened in 1674, the year after the expedition to the Mississippi. That summer, Jolliet traveled to Quebec to make his report to Frontenac, the governor of New France, and that fall Marquette began a trip back to the Illinois village of Kaskaskia. As in the previous videos, the script is mainly composed of selected and condensed quotations from the story or récit written by Father Claude Dablon for his report to Paris. In addition, the script also includes quotations from Marquette's own autographed journal that he kept on the trip to Kaskaskia, as well as a quotation from a letter by Jolliet. In the previous video, the Mississippi expedition ended with Marquette and Jolliet returning to the St. Francis Xavier mission near Green Bay at the end of September 1673. Marquette stayed at the mission while Jolliet and the young slave they had received from the Illinois at the Peoria village went back to Sault Ste. Marie, where Jolliet had a fur trading post. By then it was October and too late to travel to Quebec. But in the following May, Jolliet, accompanied by 2 men and the young Illinois slave, left Sault Ste. Marie for Quebec by the traditional northern route. Jolliet described this journey in his letter to Bishop Laval, written in October of 1674. It is not long since I am back from my voyage to the Sea of the South. I was favored with good fortune during the whole time, but on my return, when I was about to reach Montreal at the end of June or early July, my canoe capsized in the Lachine or St. Louis Rapids, and I lost 2 men and a box wherein were all my papers and my journal, with some curios from those far-off countries. I am much grieved over the loss of a 10-year-old slave who had been presented to me. He was of a good disposition, quick-witted, diligent, and obedient. He could express himself in French and was beginning to read and write. I lost consciousness, and after 4 hours in the water, I was found by fishermen, who never go to the place and who would not have been there if the Blessed Virgin had not obtained for me this grace from God, who stayed the course of nature in order to rescue me from death. Except for this shipwreck, Your Excellency would have had a quite interesting relation, but all I saved was my life. Jolliet lived for 26 more years, dying in 1700. Dablon's description of him in the récit may be the best way to remember him. They, Talon and Frontenac, were not mistaken in the choice that they made of Sieur Jolliet to lead the expedition. For he is a young man born in this country, who possesses all the qualifications that could be desired for such an undertaking. He has experience and knows the languages spoken in the country of the Ottawas, where he has passed several years already. He possesses tact and prudence, which are the chief qualities necessary for the success of such a difficult and dangerous voyage. Finally, he has the courage to dread nothing, where everything is to be feared. And now on to Marquette's description in his autographed journal of his journey to the Illinois at Kaskaskia. In late October of 1674, he wrote, "Having been compelled to remain at St. Francis Xavier throughout the summer of 1674, on account of an ailment, of which I was cured in the month of September, I awaited there the return of our people from down below, Quebec, in order to learn what I was to do with regard to my wintering. They brought me orders to proceed to the mission of La Conception among the Illinois. After complying with your Reverence's request for copies of my journal concerning the Mississippi River, I departed with Pierre Porteret and Jacques Largelier on the 25th of October, 1674, about noon. We learned that 5 canoes of Potawatomi and 4 of Illinois had started to go to the Kaskaskia. The Illinois assemble in the evening in our cabin and ask us not to leave them, as we may need them, and they know the lake better than we do. We were detained there for 5 days on account of the great agitation of the lake, although without any wind, and afterward of the snow, which was melted on the following day by the sun and a breeze from the lake. They reached the Milwaukee River on November 23rd. Then the cold began, and more than a foot of snow covered the ground. It has remained ever since. 11 days later, we started with a favoring wind and reached the river of the Portage, the Chicago River, which was frozen to the depth of half a foot. And about a week later, having encamped near the Portage 2 leagues, about 5 miles up the river, we resolved to winter there, as it was impossible to go farther, since we were too much hindered, and my ailment did not permit me to give myself much fatigue. In early February of 1675, Marquette wrote, "I am beginning to feel much better and to regain my strength." And finally, at the end of March, he wrote, "On the 28th, the ice broke up and stopped above us. On the 29th, the waters rose so high that we barely had time to decamp as fast as possible, putting our goods in the trees and trying to sleep on a hillock. The water gained on us nearly all night, but there was a slight freeze and the water fell a little while we were near our packages. The barrier has just broken, the ice has drifted away, and because the water is already rising, we are about to embark to continue our journey to Kaskaskia." This ends Marquette's autograph journal. The remaining story is told by quotations from de Blanc's receipt. Arriving at the village, Kaskaskia, on April 8th, he was received as an angel from heaven. After he had assembled at various times the chiefs of the nation, he resolved to address all in public in a general assembly which he called together in the open air, the cabins being too small to contain all the people. It was a beautiful prairie close to a village, which was selected for the great council. This was adorned, after the fashion of the country, by covering it with mats and bearskins. Then the father, having directed them to stretch out upon lines several pieces of Chinese taffeta, attached to these 4 large pictures of the Blessed Virgin, which were visible on all sides. The audience was composed of 500 chiefs and elders, seated in a circle around the father, and of all the young men who remained standing. They numbered more than 1,500 men, without counting the women and children, who are always numerous, the village being composed of 500 or 600 fires. The father addressed the whole body of people. Then he said Holy Mass, and gave to that mission the name of the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin. But by April 15th, his illness was getting worse. He was listened to by all those peoples with universal joy, and they prayed him with utmost entreaty to come back to them as soon as possible, since his sickness obliged him to return to St. Ignace. The father on his side expressed to them the affection which he felt for them, and the satisfaction that they had given him, and pledged them his word that he or some other of our fathers would return to carry on that mission so happily inaugurated. After the Illinois, filled with great esteem for the gospel, had taken leave of the father when they reached the Chicago Portage, he continued his journey, and shortly after reached the lake of the Illinois, upon whose waters he had to journey nearly 100 leagues by an unknown route whereon he had never before traveled, for he was obliged to coast along the southern shore of the lake, having come by the northern. But his strength was so rapidly diminishing that his 2 men despaired of being able to bring him alive to the end of their journey. Indeed, he became so feeble and exhausted that he was unable to assist or even to move himself, and had to be handled and carried about like a child. Meanwhile, he preserved in that condition an admirable equanimity, resignation, joy, and gentleness, consoling his dear companions and encouraging them to suffer patiently all the hardships of that voyage, in the assurance that God would not abandon them after his death. On May 17, 1675, having perceived a river, on the shore of which stood an eminence that he deemed well suited to be the place of his interment, today's Ludington, Michigan. He told them that that was the place of his last repose. On the following day, May 18, 1675, his dear companions having afterward rejoined him, all disconsolate, he comforted them and inspired them with the confidence that God would take care of them after his death in these new and unknown countries. He thanked them for all the charities which they had exercised in his behalf during the whole journey, and entreated pardon for the trouble that he had given them. Finally, he promised not to forget them in paradise. They drew near to him, and he embraced them once again, while they burst into tears at his feet. Then, having himself removed his crucifix, which he always carried suspended around his neck, he placed it in the hands of one of his companions, begging him to hold it before his eyes. When they believed him to be near his end, one of them called aloud, "Jesus, Mary." The dying man repeated the words distinctly several times, and, as if at these sacred names something presented itself to him, he suddenly raised his eyes above his crucifix, holding them riveted on that object, which he appeared to regard with pleasure. And so, with a countenance beaming and all aglow, he expired without any struggle, and so gently that it might have been regarded as a pleasant sleep. Marquette's story does not end here. In the receipt, Dablon wrote that 2 years later, in the spring of 1677, God did not permit that a deposit so precious should remain in the midst of the forest, unhonored and forgotten. The Indians named Kaskaskia, who have been making public profession of Christianity for nearly 10 years, and who were instructed by Father Marquette when he lived at the Point du Saint-Esprit at the extremity of Lake Superior, and whom he aided and accompanied on the migration from there back to Sault Ste. Marie when they had to flee because of the Sioux, these Kaskaskians carried on their last winter's hunting in the vicinity of the Lake of the Illinois. As they were returning in the spring, they were greatly pleased to pass near the grave of their good father, whom they tenderly loved. And God also put it into their hearts to remove his bones and bring them to our church at the mission of St. Ignace, at Michilimackinac, where those Indians make their abode. They repaired then to the spot, and resolved among themselves to act in regard to the Father, as they are wont to do toward those for whom they profess great respect. Accordingly, they opened the grave and uncovered the body. And although the flesh and internal organs were all dried up, they found it entire, so that not even the skin was in any way injured. This did not prevent them from proceeding to dissect it, as is their custom. They cleansed the bones and exposed them to the sun to dry. Then, carefully laying them in a box of birch bark, they set out to bring them to our mission of St. Ignace, from which Marquette and Jolliet had set out for the Mississippi almost exactly 4 years earlier. There were nearly 30 canoes which formed in excellent order that funeral procession. When they drew near our house, Father Nouvelle, who is its superior, with Father Pierson, went out to meet them, accompanied by the Frenchmen and Indians who were there. Before conveying it, the box containing Marquette's bones, to land, they intoned the De Profundis, Psalm 130, in the presence of the 30 canoes, which were still on the water, and of all the people who were on the shore. The Indians often come to pray over his tomb.